Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this sunny but chilly day, Tuesday. Today we are going to be talking about the Minnesota Dream Act. So it's an overview training for the 2021-2022 school year. And so my name is Kat Klima. I am the Outreach and Communications Coordinator at the Minnesota Office of Higher Education, and I'm joined here today by my co-chair, Beth Barsmith of the Minnesota Department of Education. You want to say hi, Beth?
Hello, I had to unmute myself. It takes me a while every time. Hello, I'm sorry I don't have my video on today. I have some construction in my house going on in the background, so no one needs to see that.
Yeah. So I'm going to be the one that you'll see today. So thank you everyone for joining us. We also have a very special guest. Her name is Meghan Flores. And she is the Manager of State Financial Aid Programs at the Minnesota Office of Higher Education. We are delighted to have her as a guest on our webinar today because she is the Dream Act expert. So thank you so much, Meghan, for being here. I will give you another introduction once we hand over the presentation to you. But for those of you who are new to the Minnesota Goes to College webinar series, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. We are happy that you're here. We do want to just give a very quick overview of what Minnesota Goes to College is. So it's Minnesota's college going initiative to provide high school students with the preparation, opportunity, and support needed to apply and enroll in college. And it is comprised of 3 different initiatives. They were all separate, and we decided to put them all under one umbrella. So the first is College Knowledge Month. That happens in October, which we have still a few days left. Thank you to all of the counselors who have been retweeting or reposting or sharing whatever platform you're using on social media. Thank you for following us and for retweeting and sharing because we've really done a big social media push this year to help students and their families. The second initiative is FAFSA and Dream Act events. So those are completion events. Obviously, the majority of them are virtual this year. In fact, all of us, at least on the OC side, are doing virtual-only presentations. And that happens through the majority of the year, October through February, and sometimes a little bit later. And finally, the initiative that we added just in the past couple of years is something called Decision Day, which is when we celebrate students' post-secondary decisions, whether it is college, or going into the workforce or the military. So that's just a very quick overview of who we are and what we're doing. You can register your site. There's only one registration for all event types, right? It's just like a one and done type of thing. And we have a lot of support for you. So we have a newsletter that goes out about every other month, sometimes quarterly. We're still working on the frequency of that. But we do offer a lot of support through Beth's email. She is an expert on emailing everything you need to know about these webinars, about upcoming resources and events. You also, as being a part of Minnesota Goes to College, there are also a lot of resources and access to post-secondary community experts, training videos, and promotional materials for when you're back in person. Moving swiftly ahead, next week in our virtual webinar series, that was a little redundant, but in our virtual series, we will be having the virtual financial aid event with Do Don't. We will be having Susan Ant from Millendale Community College and Peggy Zimmer from Minnesota High School. Those will be our panelists and our experts, and that will be on October. That's today. October 27th. So
November 3rd.
November 3rd. Okay. So what we'll cover, as you can see, are tips for site coordinators for hosting events, and you can ask burning questions to people who've done it and what's gone well. That was my dog flapping her ears, so that's you for that. Moving on, so there is also the Office of Higher Education Public Engagement Call that's happening this week. For those of you who are interested, tomorrow at 10 a.m. we are going to be discussing college student mental health, challenges, and resources to help. So you are welcome to come and enjoy that. We will also be posting all of the recordings on YouTube if you're not able to come. So we do, from the Minnesota Goes to College team, we are offering a few more resources, brand new. So they're 10 to 15 minutes each, which is great. and they are financial aid for undocumented students in Spanish and in English. And so they cover just a general overview of what the Minnesota Dream Act is, who's eligible, dependency status, just basically everything that you need to know. And most importantly, it is in Spanish and English. So please share and watch broadly. So thank you. We also have some infographics, which will hopefully be very helpful to both teachers and students and families alike. They are also both in Spanish and English, as you can see here. And if you want to find any of them, they are linked right here, and this PowerPoint will be available on our website and email app for anyone who's attended. We also have a worksheet that goes over everything you need to know. So important information, who should file the form, what is needed, and that is needed here and available on our website. And it is, at this time, unfortunately, only in English.
Can I say something about the worksheet?
Oh, sure. Is it in Spanish also?
No, it's not, but you can go back one. So this worksheet too is, I just figured out how to make it fillable. So you can, it's fillable PDF, so people can fill it out if they're, working from home or whatever. But this is a resource for both the FAFSA and the DREAM Act. So it helps people figure out what their dependency status is, whose information they need to complete the application, and basically what all is needed. So it is like a 4 to 5 page document, and we can show you where that is on the website in just a second too. And everybody will receive this PowerPoint so that you are able to go to those shortened links to find these things on our website, and we can also show you where they are in a second. Do you want to go to the next one? Okay, so this is new to you also, Kat, as of like an hour ago. But we also have a FAFSA/DREAM Act flyer that is just in Spanish. This was requested recently. We do already have an English one, but again, this has the information that's needed to fill out either one of these forms, financial aid forms. Again, students are only going to fill out one or the other, not both. But this is fillable also. You can put your event location, date, time, and who to contact. And this is also available on our website.
Okay. So did you want to give the tour right now, or would you like me to do something?
I can show it quickly.
Okay.
You just transfer it over to me. Okay. It's really brief because I know people want to also see where on our website it is, even though you have the links. Okay, so under site support, there's 3 different places. First of all, site support.
I don't see anything.
Oh, that would be helpful if I actually shared my screen with you. There you go. You see now?
Yep.
Okay, so site support, training videos is where we've put all of our videos. They just need to load. So there's several different types of videos, but they're the ones about paying for college and the new English and Spanish DREAM Act videos are here. So that's where you can find those, along with our other short videos about paying for college. Under initiatives and FAFSA events, there are financial aid resources for students and families that you can just click down to. So here's where the new FAFSA DREAM Act worksheet is. It looks like this. So it has all the infographic in it. People can fill it out. And then we have the graphic, am I dependent or independent? Oh, that's not it for some reason. Oh, that's a worksheet. I'm sorry. Right here. Who is my parent on the financial aid forms? So there's an English and Spanish version. This is where you can find what Meghan will be talking about today, the Minnesota DREAM Act application and the fact sheet in both English and Spanish that is on the Office of Higher Education's website. And the last one see if I can remember where it is. Under site support and event planning, because again, these are site coordinator type of tools. Under FAFSA events, and if you click into this folder, that's where the flyer will be. So there it is. I can stop sharing. And again, the PowerPoint and the post-webinar email will include all the links, so you can just easily get to those pages if you don't remember. All right, I think back to you and Megan.
Could you give the presenter call to Meghan? I don't have the ability to do that.
All right, and then
All right. And without further ado, thank you everyone for sticking with us. So we have Meghan Flores, a very special guest here from the Minnesota Office of Higher Education. She is the manager of state financial aid programs, and we are delighted to have her. So thankful. And she is the resident Dream Act officer. So go ahead, Meghan. Thank you so much for being here. Take it away.
Thank you, Kat. Sorry, I'm getting everything situated here. Can you hear me okay? I'm getting the thumbs up. Sorry, I have several monitors at home working from home, and so I'm like toggling everything to have the monitor on the camera I'm on. Thanks everyone for attending today. As Kat mentioned, my name is Meghan Flores. I work at the Office of Higher Education. I'm one of the managers of state financial aid programs. So the programs that I oversee are the Minnesota State Grant, the Minnesota Dream Act, the Child Care Grant, Work Study. We have a state work study program. I work with a summer academic enrichment program with a safety officer program. And then I work as kind of the liaison between the FAFSA folks with federal student aid and our state process and how we connect those two. And then I end up working, of course, with mostly issuing guidance for federal related things that touch our state programs, as well as just the state programs all around for the financial aid administrators that work on college campuses. And so most of my time is spent working directly with financial aid administrators who are administering our programs on campus, and then helping folks like Kat and Beth out to help push out information about what are our programs and benefits and what do students need to do to access them. So I know in this webinar series earlier, there was some information shared about the FAFSA and the FAFSA process, which is a federal student aid application for students who are U.S. Citizens, permanent residents, or eligible non-citizens. The piece we're going to talk about today, many pieces are similar, some pieces are different. And so that's what we'll kind of focus our time on, both the process as well as what are the benefits. And so the Minnesota Dream Act is different than DACA, but a lot of times you'll hear students who have DACA, which is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which was an executive order program issued to allow deferred action from deportation as well as authorization, work authorization, and a Social Security card, which for many students led to driver's license. That's a federal program, a federal process. And so many students who have DACA might access the Minnesota Dream Act, but there are also many students who do not have DACA or don't have access to DACA that can get access to the benefits under the Minnesota Dream Act. So today we'll talk a little bit about those nuances between the two different programs. We'll talk about how students apply for the Minnesota Dream Act program, and then what kind of documents they'll need. You'll see a lot of similarities to the FAFSA, and then what are the benefits. So one thing that not all folks know.
Yes. I'm sorry to interrupt. So what we see is what you see. It's the presenter view. Is there any way that you can make it full screen?
Bigger for you? Let me see here. Thank you for letting me know that.
Yeah, of course.
Let me see if I switch the monitors. It may have picked up my second monitor, so just one moment.
Of course. There we go.
Does that help better?
Yes, but there is a big thing right in the middle of the slide.
of you talking.
There we go. Okay.
How's that?
All
Okay.
right. Yeah.
Thank you, Kat, for letting me know that.
Yeah,
so just monitors, I have 3 of them, so I don't know which one they're looking at.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Great job. Keep going.
Yeah, no worries. Absolutely. I want to make sure everybody can see clearly and that it's not too small because that can be frustrating. So as I was mentioning, there is of course, the free application for federal student aid, the FAFSA, which hopefully you tuned in last week to hear a little bit more about. Undocumented students cannot file the FAFSA. They don't have access to that. The FAFSA is a federal application to get access to federal financial aid as well as most forms of state financial aid. But undocumented students don't have access to that. There are some states in our country who have passed separate and different legislation that is state-based legislation that grants access to state benefits for state financial aid programs and oftentimes in-state tuition or resident rate tuition, sometimes you'll hear it called. And so in the state of Minnesota, we did pass that legislation back in 2013. And essentially what we did is we changed the definition of who's a resident in our state for purposes of post-secondary higher education. Prior to the FAFSA, the Dream Act passing, we had, I think it was 9 different ways you could be defined to be a resident. All of them included the language that you were a U.S. citizen or permanent resident. When the Dream Act passed, those words were stripped from the legislation and we allowed access and more inclusivity in who could be considered a resident. You'll see here on the slide several other states have done similar legislation. It's a little bit different each state. Some just allow resident tuition rates, others allow access to financial aid programs. But it's very different depending on where a student lives. There are some states who have specifically passed legislation that does not allow access at all to even admission for public colleges and universities. But the important thing to note is that to date, a federal Dream Act has passed. That could only be passed through congressional action. And so there have been, I believe, 12 versions of a federal Dream Act, but none, unfortunately, have passed. And so that has left all of the states to individually decide what they're going to do. As I mentioned, our state statutory language is technically called the Prosperity Act. It's technically called that. I kind of wish we would have stuck with that because I think it gets confusing, federal Dream Act versus state Dream Act. But most students know it as, and we've kind of fallen into calling it the Minnesota Dream Act. We're now in our 8th award cycle of running this program. And one important thing I want to make sure that everyone is aware of is that who is a resident of our state, we as a state decide. So who's going to get the benefits, who pays into our tax base and therefore should get the benefits, is all up to us as a state. So things that happen or change with DACA, our particular state statutory language doesn't include anything about DACA, so it's not a requirement. So if things change at the federal side with that program, as they have over the past 4 years, it doesn't mean that our program goes away. The Office of Higher Education has a very strong commitment and foundational basis that everything we do is really geared towards helping every single Minnesotan complete and pursue higher education and gain a credential regardless of their race, gender, their socioeconomic status, and I would even say in this regard, their documentation status. If you live in Minnesota and you want to go to college, we want to be involved in helping you do that. And we really think that this is essential in order to enhance the state's economic vitality and really improve quality of life for our residents. And so the Minnesota Office of Higher Ed is actually who administers the Dream Act, and we'll talk a little bit more about that because it's a little bit different than how the FAFSA works. So that you have a general sense of kind of the numbers of students we're talking about, since the program's existence, I've provided some information here. You'll kind of note that the program peaked actually during the last presidential election cycle, the year of 16-17, and since then we've kind of seen some declines with the application numbers. Although the percentages I have there just kind of give you an idea of the students who apply, how many actually progress through the verification process and ultimately are awarded a state grant. So we do have fairly high numbers of students who apply do actually end up persisting through the application process. For 2021, we're just in that award cycle here with the academic year starting, so those numbers are very much still in flux. And then I've also provided for you just some average numbers of what are the average and median amount of grant that a student might be receiving from the state grant program, I should call out. So the actual statutory language for the DREAM Act is that the student must attend a Minnesota high school for at least 3 years, graduate from Minnesota high school or earn the GED, and then if they are males as of gender of birth, they are required to apply for the selective service. If that process, just to highlight that, there's been a lot of debate in the last couple of years about eliminating that requirement at the federal level. If that did indeed happen, we would file for a technical amendment to our statutory language to remove that from our statutory language as well. And then the last piece is something that really isn't actually enforced in any way, but it's this statement that, you know, if the student would have the opportunity to pursue permanent lawful immigration status, that they would, of course, pursue that. And lawful status is different than legal presence, and so DACA wouldn't actually be that. We're talking more about the things that you hear when something like a pathway to citizenship would be discussed. So as you can see, those are the requirements in law. Having DACA is not a requirement. You're not required to apply for DACA or receive it in order to receive the benefits under the Minnesota DREAM Act. However, if you remember in my earlier remarks, I mentioned that there are several definitions or ways to be considered a resident. In our state, we have a very inclusive list or expansive list of ways you can be a resident. One of those ways is, let's say you don't meet the DREAM Act, but that you graduate from Minnesota high school. Well, if you graduating from a Minnesota high school while residing in the state of Minnesota is one way to become a resident of the state of Minnesota. And so if you are legally residing or lawfully present at the time you graduate from a Minnesota high school, then you can be considered a resident for our state financial aid purposes. So for example, if you have a student maybe who didn't attend 3 years of high school in Minnesota, but at the moment in time they graduate from that Minnesota high school, they are, you know, legally residing here in the state of Minnesota. That could include a student maybe who does have DACA. So they have that lawful presence here at that point in time, and they graduate from a Minnesota high school, then they would establish residency that way. That would also be true for students you might be working with who have asylum pending, which has become a little bit more common in the last 2 or 3 cycles that I've been managing this program, where the asylum process is very lengthy. It can often take students, you know, 5 or even 10 years, unfortunately, to have that asylum granted. Once the asylum is granted, they're eligible to file the FAFSA. However, that pending status, when they're sitting there still waiting, that's when they actually aren't eligible to file the FAFSA. But if they're in that status and graduate from Minnesota high school, they could be considered a resident.
Hey, Megan.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question in the chat.
Okay, thank you, because I can't see that.
I know, it's okay. So sorry if I interrupt you occasionally. It says, what would constitute or be an example of unlawfully residing here? So we can have an example in front of us.
So lawfully residing could include if they're here under DACA, so their DACA status, or the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival, which until recently was always 2 years. If that work authorization or that DACA status is active at the point in time the student graduates from Minnesota high school. Or let's say the student is under temporary protective status or has asylum pending. Or even if the student is under a visa, so they're lawfully present and they graduate from Minnesota high school, they would technically be considered a Minnesota resident. Many visa students on visa statuses are not eligible for FAFSA, but they could potentially be eligible for state grant under the Minnesota DREAM Act. One that we'll see, this kind of last bullet here, we'll see kind of more frequently for non-traditional age students. So maybe they earned their high school diploma or even their GED in another state in the United States and then moved to Minnesota for family or work purposes. They, reside here, they live here for 12 months or more, and then decided, I'm going to enroll in college here in the state of Minnesota. If that person was here residing under DACA, TPS, pending asylum, some sort of visa, and then began classes, then they could also establish residency that way. Are there any other questions about that, Beth, that you're seeing in the chat?
I'm sorry, I had to not listen to your answer completely. My bad. I had somebody interrupted me in my house.
That's okay.
I believe so. I have another question too, and I don't want to get too off your presentation as well, so I'll just take one more. It says, are students who graduated from high school in another state or country that meet Minnesota residency requirements eligible for Minnesota treatment?
So if a student graduated in another state or country, they would have to establish residency here in Minnesota. One way to do that would be if they are lawfully present here in the state of Minnesota for 12 months without enrolling in post-secondary education half-time or more. So let's say they graduate from, Texas, California, Wisconsin, you name it, and then they move to Minnesota.
Okay, thanks. Why don't you keep going, and then we can break for questions.
Just let me know. So let me talk about application. So again, as I mentioned earlier, Minnesota's Dream Act application, that's the state financial aid application for undocumented and documented or otherwise documented individuals in Minnesota. I kind of try to think of it as if a student can't file the FAFSA because they're not eligible, then let's ask some more questions and find out if maybe they could be included and get benefits under the Minnesota Dream Act. Again, if that language, stripping must be a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, had not been taken out of our statutory language, we would have never been able to open this up to as many students as we now can, who kind of fall into that not eligible for FAFSA bucket. So that's when we really want to kind of at least look further into their situation and see if the Dream Act might be an avenue for access. It is similar and unsimilar to the FAFSA in a lot of different ways, so I want to kind of call those out. One big difference is that although the application can be done in both English and Spanish, just like the FAFSA, you have to do it in one complete sitting. There's no way currently with our current technology to start the application and come back in and save it. Similar to the FAFSA, it does have to be completed annually each year, and so you do need to reapply. We align our Dream Act application date with the FAFSA, so on October 1st, when the FAFSA opened nationally, the Minnesota Dream Act application opened online as well. Unlike the FAFSA, you don't use the FSA ID. The FSA ID is the federal student ID, so it's only tied to a federal process. So that is not something that you need to get ahead of time in order to do the Minnesota Dream Act application. And then the data retrieval tool, or DRT, is also not an option on the FAFSA. The data retrieval tool is through a data share agreement with the IRS, which is a federal tax organization or department, and the federal student aid. So again, two federal parts of the government. They're not connected to Minnesota as a state, so we don't have that technology or ability. And then one major difference is that we do 100% verification for the Minnesota Dream Act, so students don't wait to find out if they're selected. They're all selected. And so we collect the 1040 tax return. So we take the 1040. Doesn't have to be the tax transcript. They don't have to go order something special or different. And similar to the FAFSA, we do follow the prior year. And so for the last year, we collected 2018 taxes for, for this year we're in right now, we collected 2019 taxes for 2021. And then this just kind of gives you an idea. One thing I like to call at this point of the year is just that we are, just like the FAFSA, we're running 2 cycles at once. So right now, currently, we're in the 2020-2021 academic year, but the application is out there and available for students for next year, for 21-22. So just be real careful as you're working with students or advising them which one they're selecting. We don't have the ability to merge one applicant from one aid year into the other year if they accidentally filled the wrong form. And then I also do want to mention that really great resource that Beth and Kat were highlighting in the beginning of our session, talked about that worksheet. The worksheet is a tool to use to gather the information that you're going to put into the application when you complete it online. It's not something that you can mail in like a paper application or turn in and then we'll data enter everything for you. Unless there's, an access issue to a computer or something like that, we really need students to be doing it online. So just want to call that out. And then this just kind of gives you a screenshot example of what the introductory text to the application looks like. If you select Lea en Español, it converts everything on that page into Spanish, and then you can change it back to English. So on the introductory and kind of the fine print language about what is it we're asking you for, why are we asking you for this, that's the way the application works as far as providing both languages. But when you get into the actual application itself, each question individually is presented in both English and Spanish. The questions follow, I'm not going to go through the entire application because the questions follow along the FAFSA almost to the exactness. I would say 98% of it. It's the same questions in the same order. When I program for this, I literally take out a FAFSA and line by line look at every FAFSA question, and then I go to the DREAM Act and I make the edits. And so it's very, very similar. One thing that is different is that, they're not required to put in a Social Security number. They can check a box if they don't have one, or they wish not to use their Social Security number, and then we assign them an applicant ID. So that's one thing I would highlight as different. The other piece is at the end, they check a box to certify to the best of their knowledge that this is true and accurate information that they're submitting, rather than using that FSA ID process. So there's a checkbox for a student and there's a checkbox for a parent. So that's kind of the two biggest things I would call out that are different. But aside from that, the questions themselves really aren't any different. When the student gets to that intro screen, we do give them kind of a preview of, hey, go ahead, collect this documentation. These are the things you're going to want to have with you when you're filing your Minnesota DREAM Act application. And as you can see, they're very similar to what you would be sitting down and gathering if you were going to file a FAFSA. As far as who's a dependent or who's an independent, it's also very similar. It's the exact same questions, if you're a graduate student, if you're married, if you have dependents other than your spouse that you provide the majority of the support for, the legal guardianship questions, the unaccompanied homeless youth questions, these are the exact same questions on the FAFSA. And we take those, again, as I said, word for word from the FAFSA, and the dependency status is determined the same. So when there are unusual circumstances, for example, if a student wanted to request what's called professional judgment, which if you'll recall from previous trainings, that's that little tiny bit of gray that we're given as financial aid administrators to, on an individual case-by-case basis with documentation, make a professional judgment to do something different than what the directions say to do. So for example, a dependency override, where otherwise a student would be considered dependent because all of those yes or no questions, they can't answer yes to any of them. But if there's something like a non-voluntary severance in the parent-child relationship for a variety of different reasons, or maybe that could include potentially, unfortunately, deportation. It could include situations of abuse or neglect. It could be things that have happened beyond that student's control. We do something similar in that we collect third-party documentation from an unbiased source. And there are multiple sources that could write or provide those documentations. Typically, they're accompanied by a student statement as well. On this particular piece, when it comes to professional judgment, I want to just call it that the Office of Higher Ed is who administers that program. So we do all of the application collecting, all of the verification, and any kind of professional judgment the Office of Higher Education would make. We don't involve the schools in this process, and so the student doesn't have to work with the school on it. They would work with us in the Office of Higher Education. So once the student hits submit on the application, they automatically get an email that lets them know, congratulations, you completed the application, here's what we need you to do. Every student is asked to submit a copy of their high school transcript. And when it's, in progress is fine for, estimate purposes. Later they'll be asked for a final or a copy of the diploma. And then we ask for copies of the tax returns, again, from the prior year. If the student or the parent, in the cases of a dependent student, are below that tax filing threshold where they're required to file taxes, then we will accept a W-2. If there are students who have unique situations where a W-2 maybe isn't issued, they can work with our office and we'll discuss that with them. We also have received sometimes for newer immigrant students foreign tax returns, and then we typically will just work to translate those and do currency conversion. And then as far as a work authorization card or a work permit for students who have either some sort of visa or DACA, we only ask them to turn that in if they want us to let their campus know that they're eligible for work study, which is student employment that is also offered through the state. But if they aren't interested in that, we don't require it. All of those previous documents I mentioned can be emailed. We have a central repository or a departmental email, the Minnesota Dream Act email account. That's where all of the auto-generated emails to say we received your application have come from, as well as subsequent requests for documents. And that's where students are asked to submit the documentation. The only one form that can't come in either via email would be the proof of selective service if it's a paper registration. So students who have a Social Security number, they can do this online, just like your FAFSA filing students. However, if the student doesn't have one, they do have to do a paper selective service form. They're really kind of nitpicky about the requirements. It has to be an original wet ink signature, has to be in all capital letters, and it has to be in black ink. So the student would complete that form and then paper mail it via traditional mail to our office. Once we have, as I mentioned, once the student submits their application, we send them an automated notice to let them know the documents they need, those documents we just discussed. And then we issue estimated awards. So for this current award cycle that we just opened up, the 21-22 academic year, the Dream Act application's open. Right now, students are applying. They can start sending in their documentation. We'll start reviewing that in January or February, and we will send estimated awards. So an estimate of what kind of state grant funding the student could receive in early spring. And then once the legislative process is complete and we have final numbers, we'll send final state grant awards over the summer. We always send the award notices via email, so they're never paper, and they always go based on the first school that is chosen on the drop-down list. Just like the FAFSA, a Dream Act student can list up to 10 schools, but we really only send it to the first school. If they want to see what would I get if I went to a different school, they can email us at the Dream Act email account, and we can definitely get them a new award notice to show them that. As far as schools and how the schools come into play with the Dream Act, when the student lists the different colleges or universities they're interested in, the student is then giving access to their applicant information to that school. So when we do this similar kind of training, but with our counterparts or our campus partners, we talk about best practices of how to handle that. And so we've asked the schools to incorporate any kind of state grant estimate or final that we calculate into the student's award on campus. And then many schools are getting, quite frankly, better about using the EFC we calculate through the Dream Act is the exact same EFC that is calculated through the FAFSA process. So if you had two students who had the exact same socioeconomic background, same FAFSA data elements, and they did the applications, they would get the same EFC. So we've been able to work with private scholarship organizations and institutions of higher ed to help them understand if you have need-based programs on your campus, you can include Dream Act students just like FAFSA filers because you can measure them the same. And so more and more schools are having access to those programs that are need-based grants. As far as the benefits, so the Minnesota Dream Act is just that. It's a state-based financial aid application so that non-FAFSA filers can get access to all of our post-secondary education programs. So any program that the Office of Higher Education has and the state of Minnesota has, a Dream Act student can get access to them. I've listed the most common ones here on the slide. The one caveat I would again mention is that for a student to access the Minnesota State Work-Study program, they do have to have authorization to work in the United States. So that would be a work permit, which would be probably a student who has a visa status or potentially pending asylum, and definitely the DACA students. Another benefit is being considered a resident means you can pay in-state tuition rates. At a school like the University of Minnesota, most of you probably are aware that difference is very large. It can be $10,000, $11,000, $12,000 different in the tuition bill when they're paying a resident rate tuition versus a non-resident rate tuition. Most of the two-year min-state schools no longer charge a different rate for in-state versus out-of-state, so it doesn't tend to have as much of an impact there. But our reciprocity program, where we have contracts or benefits with North Dakota, South Dakota, Wisconsin, Manitoba in Canada, and Iowa Lakes Community College, Dream Act students can access those reciprocity benefits, which are similar to paying in-state tuition for those other states as well. I'm just going to pause here before I move into a little bit more specifics about the grant program, just to see, Kat or Beth, if you're picking up any questions from the chat at this point.
Yeah, we had one.
Yeah, Beth.
Sorry, Kat. We had one question earlier. Do you know, this is about the FAFSA, you know, if you're filling out the FAFSA or the Dream Act and you're not eligible to, you know, complete that form, does it stop you? Like, I know the Dream Act does, but does the FAFSA stop you from completing it?
Okay, that's a great question. So the question was, if you are a student and you're filling out either the FAFSA or the Dream Act application, but you're really not eligible, will it prevent you from doing it? And the answer is actually no, because unless you said, for example, in the Dream Act at the very beginning, if you checked, we do ask, are you a U.S. citizen, are you a permanent resident or an eligible non-citizen, or are you neither of the above? If they check I'm a U.S. citizen, there is a pop-up that says, actually, you should be filing the FAFSA. If they check the box that says, I'm a permanent resident or an eligible non-citizen, and they check that box, it will again pop up and say, actually, you're eligible to file the FAFSA. So if they select one of those two in the Dream Act database, or excuse me, application, we do kind of say, hey, you're doing the wrong form. On the FAFSA side, if they enter in an SSN and a date of birth and all of their information and are moving through the application, it will let them submit the application. However, because the FAFSA has what we call these behind-the-scenes data matches with other federal agencies, one of which is the Department of Homeland Security. Another one is the Social Security Administration. And so there are several behind-the-scenes checks that happen once the FAFSA is submitted at the central processor. And when those issues pop up where there's not a match in information with one of those federal agencies, what's called a comment code is produced. And that appears on the school's end in their version of the FAFSA they get. That also appears on the student's end in their kind of receipt of the FAFSA, I'd like to call it, or the student aid report. So they'll get a little sentence or two, sometimes it's kind of a bigger paragraph, that explains, hey, we couldn't match. You said you were an eligible non-citizen, but when we checked with the Department of Homeland Security, or when we checked the Social Security Administration, the Social Security number you gave and the date of birth and the name don't match. So we can't confirm that that's true. You need to check in with your school.
Okay, thanks. There's another one about after you complete the Dream Act, you need to submit those documents to go with it, like the transcript, etc. Does it need to be an official transcript?
So the high school transcript?
Yeah, correct.
Okay, so no, it actually doesn't. When we ask Dream Act students for either college transcripts once they're renewal applicants or high school transcripts, they don't have to. So if the students have something like a parchment, a lot of high schools use, or they have a school portal they go into where they get progress, a transcript in progress, and then later a final transcript. It doesn't have to have the seal, that official kind of bumped raised thing. Nope, that's fine. The student copy's fine.
And then, Megan, on that note about parchment, how do students submit a copy of their transcript since NOCI or the Office of Higher Ed isn't listed as a recipient on parchment?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, so the question is, how do students submit a copy of their transcript? At our school, we use parchment, but I am guessing the OAG is not listed as a recipient on parchment.
You know, I'll confess I'm not fully aware of all of the processes behind the scene with parchment, but I get them from Dream Act students, and it says parchment on it. So somehow they must be able to extract the PDF or download it and save it to their computer and then send it to me. Because I have students send them to me and I can see there's something on it notating from parchment. Otherwise, the student might have a school portal that they log into for their high school and they can generate a transcript through that. But we might not be listed in that drop down. That's definitely maybe, Kat, if you can take a note of that, maybe we could look into how we do get listed on there.
Yeah, I will absolutely do that.
Because right now, students just send it to us as an email attachment, as a PDF.
Okay. And the other question, I am almost certain that I know it, but I just want to clarify. One of the participants asked for the 2020-2021 Dream Act. We are supposed to use the 2018 taxes. That's
correct. Yep. So. Okay. You always go prior year. So it used to always be up until prior year passed, which is complicated for us to look into, but it's actually good for students in some ways. Other students, I think it has been more challenging for them because holding on to those documents 2 years ago is really hard to track down. Fortunately, the really good news is we were able to get some FAFSA simplification passed under the current situation with the current administration and Congress to have an automated data share. So it's going to take a couple years to set this up, but that FAFSA simplification means that eventually there will be a direct data share between student and the IRS where the student doesn't even use DRT. There's just a sharing agreement between those agencies, and when they file the FAFSA, their information will seamlessly be transitioned between the two agencies. It's probably, like I said, going to take another couple years to get that ironed out. But at that point in time, which tax year they're using will matter less, and it will be a little bit, the prior year thing will be a little bit less transparent because you won't have to, say, okay, 2021, okay, not 19, okay, 18. Sometimes I get out a little graph and I draw the arrows. No shame in that.
Thank you, Megan. No, absolutely not. Whatever works.
Yeah, and I'm usually working between 3 financial aid years at the same time. And so I'm like, wait, what year, what calendar year, academic year, fiscal year, what are you talking about?
I have a couple other questions I could read out.
Absolutely.
One is, I have a senior who wants to take a summer class this summer, but does he qualify for the DREAM Act for 2021 since he doesn't graduate until June of 2021?
So that's a great question. So actually, if the student's a senior right now in high school, they probably graduate in May or June, right? And then they would start at a school that following summer. So they will have graduated high school. The way summer is handled depends on the schools. They would want to find out from the school they plan to take the class at if they treat summer as a header to the upcoming aid year or a trailer. Most of Minnesota state schools, they use summer as a trailer, so it's the end of the academic year. So for example, right now, we are in the 2021 academic year right now. Summer 21 that will happen this June, typically for those min-state schools, they have fall 2020, spring 2021, and then summer 2021. And it's a trailer or the end of the academic year. So in that case, the student would file a 2021 FAFSA or DREAM Act application, depending on their situation. But if there was a school, for example, like a quarter school, maybe Rasmussen, they treat summer typically as a header. And so the student then would be filing the 21-22 FAFSA or Minnesota Dream Act.
All right, thanks. That was kind of a tongue twister with all the 2020s and the 2021s. Another question we have is, if one of my students is in the process of getting her visa and has a social security number, is she considered an eligible non-citizen?
So this question, it sounds like, is for students who are kind of between statuses. And so what their status is their status until it's something different is what I would say. So if you have a student who has, for example, the pending asylum, they've applied, but they're still waiting. Or they have submitted a permanent residency application, but they don't have the result yet. Until they become that new status, they are what they are right now. So depending on the timing and how much you know about the student's situation, the student could be receiving state grant program dollars under the DREAM Act for the fall semester and then have their paperwork go through and be FAFSA eligible for the spring semester. Those ones we usually end up working with the student in the school real closely just to make sure, because we do need that new application filed by the 30th day of the term. But if you have students in those situations, they definitely can reach out to our office and we can help coach them through that.
Okay, thanks. And then we do have a comment about parchment. A very simple comment, thank you. It says that on parchment, students are able to send a copy of their official transcript to themselves, and then they can email that to OB, and that's probably how they've been doing it in the past.
That's probably how I see that name pop up on there.
Yeah. So you can.
Okay, so there is a way.
Yep.
The one thing I did want to point out about that last comment, Beth, on the participants' question on the FAFSA versus the DREAM Act and vice versa, although the grant you'll get if you file the FAFSA or the DREAM Act and all the data elements are the same, your state grant's going to be the same dollar amount. It's still important for students who are eligible to file the FAFSA to file it. Because again, the DREAM Act is only a state program, state application for state programs. The FAFSA is a more expansive access point because the student then gets access to federal grants, federal loans, federal work-study programs.
Okay, great. Thank you for that clarification. All right, did you want to keep going, or there's like 2 or 3 other questions we could?
I want to make sure that if folks have questions, we answer those first.
Okay. Since students cannot log back into the DREAM Act once they submit it, if they are changing their mind or transferring to a different school, how do they handle that? I think you said
so once they submit the application, we send them an automated email that lets them know about the verification documents, and then we also let them know in that text that if they want to make a change to their application, such as the school list, they can email us that. And so they would just send an email to the Minnesota Dream Act email account and let us know, I changed my mind about my top school. Can you please adjust my award offer? And so we would do that for them.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, I was also reading the chat at the same time and unmuting. Another question we have, let's see. Kat, you can help too. A lot of them are coming in, so I'm losing track of where they are. What aid is available all the time for students who fill out the Minnesota Dream Act that want to attend college outside of Minnesota and other partnered states?
So the question is about students who fill out the Minnesota Dream Act and attending schools in other states. So the only program that would be available would be the tuition reciprocity program. State grants in our state are not what's called portable, so you can't gain eligibility for a state grant by being a resident of Minnesota and then take that grant to another state. Most states don't do that because they really want to invest in students attending institutions in their state so that they'll stay in their state and then become, a contributing member of the economic engine in that state. And so our state financial aid programs go to students who are residents of our state to attend schools in our state.
Okay, thanks. I'm sorry, I forgot to mute. I think that reaches all of them so far.
Okay. Well, if there are other questions, please, no question is a bad question. There are no dumb questions. Everyone, we're kind of at a different level or place on the spectrum when we're learning about different topics. So please don't feel embarrassed to ask questions, or if it was already mentioned and you need clarity to go back to a previous topic, please feel free to do that in the chat.
Okay, I got one more.
Okay.
Now that you say that, it just popped up. If a student fills out the FAFSA and gets that no match found button, do they risk having their information used by ICE? Homeland Security gets their name and address with the FAFSA. I think that's a pretty common fear or feeling.
It's very common, actually, that students get a no match and there really is a match. So what I mean by that is, for example, I frequently would work with students. Before I worked at the Office Higher, I worked for about 20 years on college campuses running these programs. And so frequently we'd get that mismatch from Department of Homeland Security for naturalized citizens. And it might be, I would work with students who would bring in their certificate of naturalization, and I had a picture of them from when they were a baby. And I don't understand how 20 years later you can't match them. But it has something to do with their database not being perfect. And so even students who didn't just accidentally fill out the wrong form, who really legitimately filled out the correct form, the FAFSA, and didn't get a match, can later resolve that process by showing documentation to their school. So let's say they got that mismatch and they brought in their certificate of naturalization. The school aid administrator makes a notation of that on their version of the FAFSA, and that lets the Department of Ed know, I took care of that, don't worry about it. Now, if a student got that match and really filled out the accidental form or never followed up with the school, which even someone, again, who had a legitimate match could just never follow up with the school, because unfortunately that is a barrier. It's just one more thing to do, one more thing they got to take care of, and so they might have just given up. So it doesn't mean that everybody who has a mismatch then gets investigated in any kind of way. It just means they stop pursuing the process.
Okay, that is all for questions so far.
Okay. I do have a couple more slides that get into a little bit more about the benefits of the program. And so this is the Minnesota State Grant. This is our largest need-based program in the state of Minnesota. It'd be comparable to the federal program of the Pell Grant program. So the Pell Grant program on the federal level is for the neediest students. It's for, and at the state level, we also piggyback on that Pell Grant eligibility for very needy students, but it also reaches pretty far into the middle income type of student. This is gift aid. It's a grant, so it doesn't have to be repaid. Again, it's for Minnesota residents at Minnesota schools. There is a limit on how long you can receive a Minnesota State Grant. And then also just to mention, everything on this slide is true whether you get the grant via the FAFSA or the DREAM Act. It's one program. There's just two ways to apply. With the Pell Grant, you can receive it up to the equivalent of 6 years of receipt. For the state grant, you can receive it for up to the equivalent of attendance of 4 years of full-time attendance at a post-secondary education institution. And that attendance only counts once you've graduated high school. So if students have done PSEO, it does not count against their state grant usage. And then you can't be in default on a student loan or delinquent on child support to get the grant. And then you do have to be pursuing a degree, certificate, or licensure and making progress towards the completion of that credential. So to give you an idea of the value of this program, and again, whether you're a FAFSA filer or a DREAM Act filer, for our current academic year, if you are a student with a 0 EFC, this kind of gives you an idea of what kind of grant your student could expect, whether they're attending, and I just used the average 2-year, the average state university, and then for the U of M or any private institution in the state, it would be the same. So you can see here that the amount you qualify for in the grant program depends on the credit level you take. The grant caps out at 15, so whether a student takes Anything more than 15, 16, 17, 18, it's the same grant amount. And then the minimum enrollment is 3. One thing to note is that some grant levels, it's possible that a student might have 0 eligibility. For example, at that 2-year, 6 credits. And the reason for that has to do is the interplay between the state grant formula and the federal formula. The state grant formula requires us to back out the Pell Grant whether or not the student actually receives it. And right now, since there isn't a federal Dream Act, a student can't receive it. Another program we have, and since we're starting to get to that 1-hour mark, I'll go over these fairly quickly, but just to let you know, we do have a child care grant program. This is for students who have children who are attending a Minnesota school. It's also gift aid, so the student doesn't have to pay it back. A student can get this one actually a little bit longer. This one is for up to 5 years. And then we have a work study program. And so this is for students who have work authorization. They do have to actually, secure a job and work on campus or telework in order to receive the funds under the program. And then finally, we do have a state grant or a state-sponsored student loan program. This has always been eligible or available to students who don't have documentation or maybe who are international students. Because the program as a whole, every student is required to have a co-signer. So whether they're a U.S. citizen, a permanent resident, an undocumented student, it doesn't matter. They have to have a co-signer. So that in itself can be a barrier for many students, including undocumented or documented students, because the co-signer does have to be either a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident. But it is an option, and we do have some Dream Act students using this program. And then just want to make sure that you're aware that, the state grant is a need-based grant program, but it doesn't typically cover all of tuition and fees. So typically, students still would need to be working with their school on a payment plan or securing scholarship or other forms of financial aid. We do have some opportunities and some resources information on our website as well. So with that, we're kind of right at that 1-hour mark. So I wanted to pause one more time just to check in with Kat and Beth to see if we have had any other questions come in on the chat.
Nope, we haven't.
Okay, then to kind of end things, I'll just preview a little bit some of the resources we have on our website. And some of the organizations who let us know that they do specifically have scholarships that are available to undocumented or documented students or students who would be filing the Dream Act. We do also partner with and do some presentations as well as provide referrals to the Immigrant Law Center, as well as the Consulate of Mexico and Ecuador. And then also we work with Navigator Unidos Minnesota to help promote some of their resources. And then we do also have some partnerships with or referrals we provide for Prepare Plus Prosper, which is a local nonprofit that does free tax prep for folks who qualify as income qualifying. And they do help students who don't have a Social Security number or parents who might not have one apply for what's called an ITIN, or an individual taxpayer identification number, and file. We do have a call line, both a toll-free and a 651 number. If students or parents prefer Spanish, they can call me directly. My phone number is listed there. Or if there's another language, because we do have Dream Act students who are from many countries, Canada, Kenya, Portuguese-speaking countries, all kinds of different languages. And so we do have other translation services available. And then I also want to make sure to thank you for coming today, as well as make sure you have that email address. If you have general Dream Act questions, or your students do, you can refer them to the Minnesota Dream Act email account.